Right, good evening, guys. Welcome along. I'm Paul from GSE, and tonight we're going to be talking about leases, and in particular about how you can make sure that when you get to the end of your deal, that you don't fall over, you don't have any problems, and you can keep the deal moving along nice and quickly. So, if you do have any questions as we go through, feel free. Please pop them in the comments below. And if you are watching this after it's been recorded, then feel free to add them in there. We'll do the best we can to answer those questions at any time. So feel free, any questions at all that you think of about anything we talk about tonight or anything to do with leases in general, whether you're buying or selling, feel free, jump in the comments and pop them in there. We'll do the very best we can to answer them for you. All right, so let's talk quickly about who the presentation's for tonight. It's going to be a very brief presentation. I really want this to be a Q&A session. So I've got a few questions that have come in throughout the week based on the post that we put up about tonight. So we'll talk about those, but I want to just cover a few topics. Now, this is really going to help you if you're considering buying a cafe, you're not quite sure about the process and you want a little bit of advice and help around the lease side of things. Secondly, if you're somebody who's selling a cafe and you're not quite sure about the lease situation and you want to work out the best way forward when it gets to lining somebody up that's going to be taking over the lease that you've currently got. So really, either side of the table that you're on with regards to buying or selling, then if you'd like a little bit more detail about the lease situation, how you can keep the process moving, then you'll definitely get some value from tonight. All right, well, let's jump in. Let's get straight into it. So really, most people think that once you've got your offer accepted, that's it, the deal's pretty much done. But there's actually one very big hurdle that you still need to get over. And there's a few things you need to consider once that's done. But one of the biggest things is making sure that you get approval from the landlord in order for, if you're buying the business, in order for you to be allowed to take over the assignment of the existing lease from the person selling. And obviously, if you're the person selling, you want to be making sure that whoever you've got lined up is a really good fit and you're going to get that deal through. So looking at that, there's a couple of really, I guess, proactive steps that you can take as the person either buying or selling to make sure you're doing everything that you can to avoid any pitfalls. There's 4 key documents that I'll just walk you through quickly that can really help with this. And it's good to be on the front foot with any kind of lease preparation and at any stage of the deal, really. The more preparation you can put in, the better. The ideal outcome by doing this work is that you're going to reduce the risk in the landlord's mind. So it's all about putting forward a really strong case to make sure you stand the best chance as the purchaser of the landlord agreeing that you're a good fit for their business and they don't see you as a risk. The last thing a landlord wants is to lose a good tenant and to bring somebody in that they haven't vetted properly or maybe hasn't got the experience or the capabilities to continue running the business and therefore paying the rent in the way that the outgoing tenant has. So the more you can do, as I said, to get all of this organised in the front end, then the quicker it's going to be to submit that information and keep the deal moving. And secondly, by being proactive and having all of this prepared, you're sending out a really clear message to the landlord that you know what you're doing and that you're a serious player, that you've actually given this purchase some thought. So let's dive in and have a look at what those 4 documents are. So firstly, you want to be looking at producing a cover letter. And it's really just like a formal introduction, you introducing yourself to the landlord or to the landlord's agent or both. And it's going to give a little bit of background information about yourself, especially if you've got industry experience. So if you have, that's really what landlords want to see. They want to make sure that they've got somebody coming in that's capable of running the business and, as I mentioned, paying the rent, of course. So as much information as you can. It doesn't have to be a huge document. A 1-pager is more than adequate for this kind of thing. So whatever you can do just to, as I said, introduce yourself, give a bit of background and make sure that the landlord's feeling comfortable about who you are as a person, as an operator. It's an important, a lease is obviously a very big binding document, and it's really important, therefore, that the relationship gets off to a good start. So put your best foot forward, give them a decent cover letter introduction, and make sure you're doing everything you can to make that first impression really count. Next up, you're going to need to think about an assets and liabilities statement. So this is where you're demonstrating that your financial standing and you're capable financially of taking on the business And you know, you're not going to be in a position, or the landlord's not going to be having to chase you basically in a few months' time because you haven't got enough behind you. So they don't want to see that you're overstretching to make the purchase. And this is all about putting the landlord's mind at rest that financially you're quite secure and you're a safe bet. So this document, usually it's a simple one-page document, as you'd expect. On one side there, you've got liabilities, and the other side, the assets. So in the assets column, you're going to be putting things down there, such as your house or any property or investments that you have, details about any motor vehicles and cars that you've got, fixtures and fittings and furniture, jewelry, anything you can think of that's actually that you own and is an asset, you're going to list in that column. And then the left-hand side, you're going to put any finance that's outstanding on those assets. So that's obviously going to be the mortgage on any of those properties. Maybe you've got a car loan, credit cards, or any other personal loans. You're going to list those into the liability side. And then at the bottom of each of those columns, you're going to total them up, and that will then give you the difference will be your net worth. That's what the landlord or the agent, whoever's vetting you, is going to be looking for. So really important to remember that it's quite a binding document. Again, this is an important document, and you should be very careful to make sure that everything you put on here is 100% accurate. It's no good trying to make things look different to how they actually are, because you will need to provide information backing up everything you've said. So if you're putting down a certain mortgage amount, you will have to produce a mortgage statement. If you're putting down a bank balance, you will need to produce bank statements. And the same with everything that you put on here. So keep it 100% straight, make sure it's accurate, and do the best to fill it out with, you know, obviously you want to be playing on the strengths of your assets, but there's no way you should be considering putting down things that aren't accurate on there. So a really good thing to have prepared, and it's actually a good process to go through personally as well. So you can get hold of one of these. You can usually find this sort of thing online. It's a pretty basic document. You don't even need a template, to be honest. You can work out, even in a spreadsheet, exactly what you need to do. So go through that prior to being asked for it, again, just so that when you do have to provide it, you've got it ready to go and you can get that pushed through. All right, so the next thing that you really want to consider and that you will need to complete is what's called the retail lease application. So this is the formal application, usually provided by the real estate agent acting on behalf of the landlord. Sometimes it's provided by the broker if there's a broker involved in the deal. Sometimes it will come from the solicitor acting for the landlord. So regardless of who it comes from, you could have, again, proactively try and seek one of these out and make sure you have it all completed and ready to go. These are typically like a 4-page document, and on there, the first page is usually just about the shop itself, so the location, the bond. It's going to have different things about the rent and all the terms of the lease and so on. Second page is just covering the terms of the agreement, so what you're actually signing and what you're agreeing to. Again, this is a very important document, so really pays to go through this in a bit of detail, make sure that you're not missing anything, and double check all the information that's been added there in relation to what you've been told about the terms of the bond and the terms of the rent and increases and all that kind of thing. So third page is all about you. Now you will find there's a bit of an overlap here sometimes with what information you're providing here and what you've already put on the assets and liability statement, but don't worry too much about that. Make sure you complete this in full, even if you're doubling up on a bit of entry there. It's a good idea to make sure you're covering all the bases the best that you can. Okay, and then the final page really is just a recap. There's a bit of next of kin information and signatures. So a pretty straightforward document. Again, take some time, go through it, make sure everything on there is 100% accurate. Okay, and then the final thing that we always suggest that you look at, consider doing and submitting at this stage is something that really doubles up to your benefit as well, and that's a business plan. Now, this doesn't have to be a huge 10-page document or anything like that. A simple one-pager is more than enough. I think this sends out a really clear message that you're a serious business operator, that you've given some thought to the business, you've looked at how it is. This is also a good opportunity. Again, it's all about reducing the risk in the landlord's mind. And it's an opportunity here, and hopefully you are buying a good business, it's an opportunity to give them reassurance that you're not making any radical changes straight away. So they're going to be concerned about change. Everyone fears changing a little bit. So here is a good opportunity to kind of reassure them that, one, you've given some thought to the numbers of the business and the purchase. Two, you've got a plan. You've actually got some ideas about what you're going to do. And three, that you're not going to make any radical changes and change the style of food and potentially, put a seed of doubt or increase the risk in their mind. So it's something that I think, if you're buying a business, buying a cafe, buying any kind of business, or even in business, a business plan is a really important thing to have anyway. It doesn't, as I said, have to be a big complicated document, but you should have an idea of what your goals are. Be looking at what the business did last year and what your projections are, cash flow forecasts and that sort of things. Really good. Send out a clear signal to the landlord. You've put some thought into this transaction and this deal, and you're actually 100% committed to making the business work. So again, it's not something that's essential, and many people don't ask for that. I think it's better to put forward more information than you asked for, and demonstrate that you are actually, thinking very seriously about things than doing the bare minimum. So good idea to, bear in mind all of those things, what you've got to do, and have some of that information ready to go, so that as and when you do get asked for it, you can complete those forms nice and quick and get the information back and stand the best chance of, keeping the deal moving nice and quick. So in summary then, it comes back to preparation, and you'll notice in my, the way that we talk about things at GSE and our approach generally, a lot of it is around preparation, making sure that the more prepared you are, then the easier the deal is going to be for everybody. So at this stage, really, there's nothing worse than a deal falling over in the final stages. When, you've agreed a price between the two of you, everyone's happy with what you've agreed. It gets to the landlord, and either the application's not put forward properly or the application's not strong enough. The landlord's well within their rights to say no if they feel that the person coming in doesn't stack up in the right way. So the more preparation you can do here, the better. Make sure that you're doing everything you can to keep that deal on track. All right, so let's just dive in and have a quick look. There were, as I mentioned, I had a few questions come through during the week on the email. So we'll just cover those, and then we'll dive into any other questions that you might have. But hopefully that's given you a bit of insight into maybe something that you weren't aware of that you're going to be asked for, and is giving you the opportunity to go into it a little bit more prepared. And as I said, keep that deal moving in the latter stages. You don't want it slowing down or falling over at that point. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight. We'll just cover some questions, and then at the end I'll give you some details if you'd like some more information or you need some help. We'll give you some details about what you can do and where you can get that from. All right, let's just jump in. I've just got 4 questions on the email. So Jane in Adelaide asked, how much should the legal fees be when negotiating a lease? A great question, Jane, and it's something that we do see quite a variance in legal fees for very similar transactions. So this it's going to be twofold, I guess. So firstly, if it's a straightforward transaction, and when I say that, I mean there's no hiccups with the with the deal itself. And if you're looking at just assigning the lease from the person that you're buying from, then that's pretty straightforward. You should be expecting to pay, I would estimate, around $2,500 to $3,500 for the legal fee. So that's covering the lease as well as the contract of sale and everything to do with the purchase of the business. So that's a kind of a rough guide. If you are negotiating a new lease, so there's probably going to be a bit more work involved in that. So there'll be more toing and froing between the solicitors, a bit more back and forth. So you could potentially be paying a little bit more if it's a new lease. So if it's an assignment, 2.5 to 3.5, and maybe allow a little bit more if you're negotiating a new lease. So bear in mind though, that's usually a good trade-off. If you're paying a bit more legal fees to get a stronger lease, it's money well spent. So hopefully that answers that for you, Jane. Peter has asked, is 5% a reasonable amount for an annual increase? So Peter, probably going to say that that's towards the top end of what we're seeing at the moment. It's not uncommon, but it's definitely towards the higher side, if you like. We're noticing, like, as new leases are coming through, so as terms expire, the new leases are being granted, because the CPI which was typically the standard increase or the more common increase that you saw in leases. Because the CPI has been so low over the last few years, landlords have obviously now got wise to that, and because they're not getting an uplift or a decent uplift in their leases and their rent, they're putting a fixed percentage increase into the terms now. Typically, over the first period, it might be anywhere from it could be a combination of CPI plus 1.5%, 2%, something like that, or it could be a 3%, 4%, or 5% fixed price increase. So it is not uncommon to see 5%. It's probably, as I said, towards the top. If you've got the opportunity to negotiate, you could probably try and squeeze that down a little bit. So hopefully that answers that one for you, Peter. Thanks for getting in touch. And Dipu in Sydney has asked, can I negotiate a rent-free period when I take over the cafe that I'm looking at buying? So Dipu, it comes back in ways, partly to the question that Jane asked, depending on the type of lease that you're taking on. So if you're buying the business and going straight assignment, so continuing the existing lease, then it's extremely unlikely that the landlord will give you a rent-free period, because you're basically, the assignment is saying that you're agreeing and taking on the existing terms in the lease. So there's not really any benefit or any reason, to be honest, why the landlord would give a rent-free period if it was an assignment. If you are going for a new lease, then typically the landlord will at that point take the opportunity to increase the rent slightly, and that gives you a little bit of leverage there, especially if you're looking at maybe reinvesting some money into the shop and refitting and making a few changes. You've probably got a little bit of leverage there. If it's a new term, if it's a new lease, then you could potentially try and negotiate a rent-free period at that point. So hopefully that's cleared that one up for you. And Susan has asked, what's the normal term for a cafe lease? So Susan, it's more common to see a 3x3, or a 3+3, whichever way you look at it, or a 5x5. Those are the two most common. I think there's probably, of the businesses that we've got listed at the moment, there's probably a slightly higher percentage on the 3x3 versus the 5x5. Some of them, they will have a variation added to them, so an additional term added on as well. But typically those terms, 3x3, 5x5, and usually with the rental increases, as I said, they're either the old ones coming out with CPI or CPI plus fixed increase. And then you've got at the end of the first term, before you exercise the option, usually then there's what's called a market review. So at that point, the market price of the shop is used to determine what the ongoing rent or the future rent is going to be. So that's a really good opportunity. If the market has shifted backwards, you do stand a chance, and we have helped a couple of people do this, you stand a very good chance of actually getting the rent reduced at that point. So 3x3 or 5x5, the most common. Sometimes you'll get them, as I said, with a variation with an additional term added on. And sometimes you'll get multiple terms, so 3x3x3, 5x5x5, just depends. But typically 3x3, pretty standard. 5x5 again, pretty common. Those are the two that we see the most. Okay, so maybe that's answered a few questions that you've had as well, and thank you to you guys for emailing in. Always good to get some feedback about the kind of things that you're thinking about and you're concerned about. Really like to make sure that we're doing all we can to try and help you on both sides of the table. So, okay, let's just dive in. So I'm just going to have a quick look through some of the questions that have come in on the chat since then. So Aaron's asking what the top 5 things to look for in a lease, and is it best to negotiate a longer term? So great question, Aaron, and good to have you on. I thought I recognised your name pop up there. So yeah, the top 5 things, probably you're going to be looking at what the rental increases are, that percentage that we just spoke about there in relation to Peter's question. Be looking in there to make sure that there's no demolition clause in there. You want to make sure that anything in the lease, are there any special terms or special conditions in relation to plant and equipment that might belong to the landlord? Typically air conditioning is one of those. So you would have, in most cases, fixed plant would belong to the landlord. So you want to be looking at who's responsible for that. And sometimes there's other equipment included as well. So make sure you understand, what happens if something breaks. If there's a cool room that's included, if that breaks down, who's responsible for it? If it needs replacing, what's the deal? That kind of thing. So yeah, rental increases, demolition clause. The assignment clause is a good one to look at. So it gives you the heads up, as and when you come to sell that business, how's the landlord going to be looking at that kind of thing. Those are probably the key things that I'd suggest you look at, other than the obvious, which is the rent, and make sure that you understand that. When it comes to the term, in answer to the second part of your question, then it depends. It depends on how you feel. Some people will want to take a short term to start with if they're not 100% confident about where they're going into and how it's going to go. So if you go straight into a 5x5, for example, and it doesn't go the way that you've hoped it will, you're committed to 5 years. So sometimes you'll see people negotiate a shorter period with a longer term at the end. If you're looking at from an exit planning point of view, then the lease is an extremely important part of the sale process, and the more time you've got on there, the better. So I would suggest, if you're confident in your abilities, you're confident in the business that you're buying, then yes, a decent term is going to be better for you in the long run. You want some time to get in there to make your money, get your money back, and then of course have a bit left on there to sell the business on to somebody else. Or of course you can negotiate a new term, before you decide to sell the business. All right, let's move on. So another question there. So, do you find private landlords are open to rent-free periods and/or fit-out contribution? So, yes, it very much comes down to the individual and how commercially minded that person is, what type of property it is, what size of investment you're looking at putting in. So yeah, we've got some we're dealing with at the moment that won't give an inch, and we've got others, very flexible, very savvy, understanding that if they find the right tenant, they're willing to put in a serious contribution towards fit out costs. It works well for both sides, and really smart landlords know that. So definitely the private side of landlords, they will be open to that. I guess like any deal, it's making it work for them as well as you. It's no good it all being one-sided on what you want. It's about going in there and negotiating the deal to give them something, to give them enough for them to understand that they're actually getting a pretty good deal, and they're getting a good tenant in there. So in the early stages, if you don't have a great deal of experience, for example, then you're going to be in a weaker negotiating position. It's really about you proving yourself to the landlord, and not really about asking for too much up front. It's really asking for permission, effectively, in order to go on the lease. So I would suggest that if it's like an empty building, for example, and you're going in there and taking that on, then definitely there should be a contribution from the landlord, and most of them will offer that up front. That's usually a negotiable figure as well. If it's an existing business, then there's less benefit to the landlord in some respects to do that. So private landlords usually very easy to deal with, and always prefer dealing with them over the shopping centres, for example, that can be a bit ruthless. I think, Aaron, you've probably had some experience with that as well. Okay, so next up we've got what would you consider good rent percentage for a cafe? So again, great question. Typically, one of those benchmark figures that gets talked about quite a lot is 10%. So I'll normally base that off 10% of net turnover is a guide of what you're looking to do. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions, like with everything in life, to that, but that's a pretty good benchmark to go for. If you're at 10% or below, then you're doing pretty well, and that's good. Naturally, the lower you can get that, the better. Some of the bigger businesses we've got listed at the moment with higher turnovers and solid leases, they might be down 5, 6, 7%. Some of the others that have got reasonable locations and are underperforming, they might creep up to sort of 15, 16%, something like that. So if you aim for 10% or below of net turnover, then you'll definitely be on the right track. Next question, clauses. What clauses do you recommend looking out for? So I think we covered that one. Early on. Yeah, look, demolition clause. That's a real bone of contention. I've heard a lot of people recently saying that demolition clauses are normal. Well, there's a lot of demolition clauses around, but I wouldn't go as far to say as that it's a normal thing to expect a demolition clause or to see a demolition clause in a lease. It's not the end of the world if you come across that, but it's going to seriously affect the value of the business if there's a potential risk that in 2 years' time you could be given 6 months' notice and have to vacate. So if there is a demolition clause, then it's really important that you take some advice on how aggressive that demolition clause is. Some of them, they're actually, in some instances, they'll pay you a fixed fee or an agreed amount or a market rate or some percentage if they decide to exercise that clause. Some leases, some demolition clauses, you don't see that at all. So a demolition clause doesn't mean the end of a deal. It doesn't mean the end of the world, but it's really good to make sure that you understand the terms of what that clause mean. And of course, the impact potentially that could have on your business and the resale value. So demolition clause, definitely one to look out for. If you see it, I certainly wouldn't walk away from a deal, but I would investigate it more carefully. And I'd also have the conversation with the landlord or with the agent and with your solicitor as to whether you can do that. We do actually work with a specialist cafe solicitor who has successfully negotiated demolition clauses out of leases. So it by no means means the end of the deal. It just means it's something that from your side of things as the buyer should be flagged as a little bit of risk, and you want to take some advice and get your head around it. So, okay, so let's just carry on through. So, wouldn't sharing your cash flow forecast give a landlord a reason to charge you more? So, no, it's not going to do that. You're protected with the lease. In most cases, most deals, you're going to be taking the assignment of the existing lease. So that is going to protect you. So the landlord can't just decide to put the rent up because you're doing well or you're successful. You're very well protected with the lease. It's an extremely binding document on both sides. So, most landlords are smart enough to understand that they want their tenants to be successful. They want them to make money. The lease protects you with regards to what the rent is, when it's increased, how much it's increased, and then at the end of the term, you're protected by the current market. So yeah, look, if the current market at the end of that time, if your market rent is below where the current market is, and the landlord knows you're doing well, of course, they're going to try and put the rent up. It doesn't mean that they can just decide to whack it up by any amount that they want to. There's legislation and laws in place to protect you from that. And the lease is, as I said, a very binding document on both sides. So yeah, an important thing to consider. But yeah, good point, good pickup, and always worth considering. Okay, next up, wouldn't showing your net worth also possibly give the landlord thought to charge you more? So no, going back to the point I've just made with regards to the lease and how protected you are from your side of the deal with that, then that doesn't give the landlord that. What it's going to do, the stronger that assets and liability statement is, basically the lower the risk in the mind of the landlord. So it's actually going to put their mind at rest. They don't want somebody coming in that's completely stretched and is using all of their resources to buy the business and hasn't allowed for, having some thought around the cash flow and how they're going to run the business. So I wouldn't worry about sharing that information, the assets and liabilities and the cash flow. It's all demonstrating you're a good prospect, i.e. you've got financial resources, and also you've thought about where you're going with the business and what you're going to do. So next up, do landlords, private landlords, have mandatory consideration around refurbishment? So no, not in the way, and I know where you're coming from this with the shopping centres and the bigger landlords, where they typically will want a refurbishment of 3 or 5 or end of term. With private landlords, then no, as the lease transfers from one person to the other, all of those conditions within inside that lease, as I mentioned, transfer across. Will basically, it's going to cover you in that respect as well, and that means that with a private landlord and a standard retail lease, it's going to state that at the end of the term, you will need to if you decide to vacate, you will need to put the building back to the way it was originally. So let's say, for example, you do run out the term of a lease and you decide to move out, you're not selling the business, no one else is taking the lease on, then potentially you will have to put all the four walls back, take all of the equipment out and leave the place completely decorated and good as new. But if you're just selling the business on or signing the lease to somebody else, then no, you don't need to worry about the mandatory refurbishment as with shopping centres. So, okay, and I think that's about all the questions we've got in the live chat. So if there are any coming through in the Facebook comments or later on, we'll make sure, we'll make sure that we answer those as and when they come in. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. If you do have any questions or you need any help, or there's anything else you think of, then you can feel free to get in touch at any time. We're always happy to have a chat and try and help you out, as I said, regardless of which side of the deal you're on. So feel free to give us a call. You can find details on our website. You can give us a call on the 1300 during business hours, of course, or just jump onto the website, jump on the contact form there and either get in touch with myself or Rob. So we're very passionate about what we do. We love dealing with cafe people on both sides of the deal. We both come from hospitality backgrounds, so we're quite happy to talk about this type of thing until the cows come home. So if there's nothing that there's something that we haven't covered tonight that you're concerned about, do please jump on the comments on Facebook or just get in touch via email or phone. We'll do what we can to help you out. All right, guys, I hope that's been of some use to you, and look forward to hopefully speaking to you in the near future. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks, guys.